So what do you call this?
So my name is Karen Howland, and I do pup play. Pup play is within the wide world of BDSM and kink. And I'm also a human.
Numerous fields have been interested in deviance, but anthropology has historically offered a uniquely critical approach. That is, unlike criminology, sociology, or even psychology, which has sought to control, reform, or even cure behaviors, perspectives, and desires deemed deviant, early anthropologists argued that deviance was relative, determined by the local cultural context and values. Working in the early 20th century, Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead were interested in culture and personality. They explored how different cultures cultivated and rewarded different actions, orientations, temperaments, and personality traits. What was normal and expected in one culture might be highly undesirable in another, but outliers in one culture might be admired in another.
I'm a happiness researcher, subjective well-being researcher. So the main question is things like, who is happy? And in the United States, we find again and again, extroverts are the happy one. Introverts, not so much. This finding has been replicated again and again and again, one of the most robust findings in subjective well-being research. If we hadn't done any cross-cultural research, that's the state of knowledge, right? But then we collected data in Germany and Japan, and guess what? Extroverts are not that much more happier than introverts in Germany or in Japan. Then you can start asking questions, why? And then we think that, well, in America, it's on your own in terms of what kind of social networks, friendship network you have. So extroverts have a tremendous advantage, right? Just talking to strangers, expanding their social networks and so forth, and that helps. I think extroverts have tremendous advantage in American culture in general. On the other hand, in a place like Germany or Japan, where people don't move around that much, the people's social network is pretty much the same since the childhood or early adulthood, then what's the point of being extrovert? What's the point of talking to strangers? So I think we can dig deeper into the function of personality by studying cross-culturally, and sometimes we think, we conceptualize the things like, oh, extroverts are the happy one. Without cross-cultural psychology, I think we have misleading, understanding.
Over the last century, anthropology has moved away from broad ideas about typical cultural types, or one could say stereotypes. While acknowledging shared patterns, beliefs, and behaviors that make significant cultural differences on individual members, ethnographers now give more attention to individual nuances and idiosyncrasies. Psychological anthropologists have taken the lead in studying many general aspects of identity, emotion, and development, designing methods that can also get at the heart of atypical or extreme experiences, such as mental illness, altered states of consciousness, and stigmatized difference. But rather than essentializing some uniformity of cultural feeling or belief, fieldwork seeks to gather both cultural information and individual interpretation.
Kalau jalan itu saya harus berhenti terus jilat ini lidah terus tak tempelin di kaki yang agak keju-keju.
Saya punya perasaan harus melakukan.
Iya, harus melakukan itu.
Kalau tidak,
rasanya itu menyiksa perasaan sekali. Terus kalau mau tidur juga kadang harus gini nih. Itu pasti saya lakukan.
Mungkin kalau menurut kultur di sekitar budaya di sini, ini kira-kira karena apa, Mas Esther?
Kalau saya mungkin keturunan ya. Ya, nggak tahu juga.
Kalau menurut Ibu, Bu, mungkin budaya di sini, orang-orang masyarakat sini mengatakan kondisi seperti Mas Esther ini apa? Syarat dan pada umumnya itu karena apa?
Iya.
orang-orang belum pada tahu itu Mas, belum tahu itu. Taunya ya itu bergerak sendiri itu.
Some methods in psychological anthropology take inspiration from clinical disciplines. Anthropologists using these methods are often trained in psychiatric or psychoanalytic interviewing techniques. Clinical ethnography seeks detailed information about intimate aspects of individuals' lives, desires, and experiences. Introduced by Gilbert Hurt and Robert Stoller in the 1980s, and first used in the field to explore culture's impact on gender identity and sexual behavior in Papua New Guinea, clinical ethnography is also used in studies of psychiatric and other illnesses, sometimes quite literally carried out in health clinics. For anthropologist Tanya Lerman, clinical ethnography has revealed differences in how culture can influence the symptoms of schizophrenia.
You developed a questionnaire about the contents of hallucinations, like what kinds of voices people hear and how they interact with them. And you asked people in America, Ghana, and India these questions.
So I thought that the two most important differences are you hearing good things or bad things? And do you know the person who is talking? What I found was that compared to both Ghana and India, Americans were much more likely to deny positive voices, and Americans were much less likely to know who was speaking. In Ghana, people would hear God, and they will often say, and God tells me not to pay attention to these negative voices. Mm-hmm. They'll often reject the idea of hearing negative voices. They often have that experience. And the Americans are plenty religious. Mm-hmm. Almost everybody I talk to in America is religious in some way. So they have a God who could, in theory, talk.
Why do you think Americans who do believe in God did not hear God?
I think that in the U.S., even though most people are religious, we have a secular model of the mind. We think that the mind is a possession. We think our mind is fundamental to who we are. And when that citadel of your authenticity is challenged, when you fear that your mind is broken, it's a horrifying thought. And that idea is not absent elsewhere, certainly not absent in Chennai and Accra and Cape Coast, but I think it's so salient in America that when people start to have these odd experiences, they immediately interpret them as a sign that they're going crazy. Mm-hmm.
Clinical ethnography has contributed to the field of transcultural psychiatry, with researchers and clinicians seeking to understand the cultural differences that might improve outcomes in patient treatment. Key concepts here include idioms of distress, or culturally specific ways of talking about or expressing psychological or emotional suffering. These idioms may often include somatized symptoms, the physical manifestation or articulation of psychological or emotional suffering.
The idea was introduced by the anthropologist Mark Nichter, who at the time was working in South Asia with Brahmin women. And he talked about the idea that there were culturally prescribed ways or culturally accepted, known, common ways of expressing distress. But he listed all kinds of things. He listed complaining of fatigue and pain. He listed, in this case it was women in South Asia, people complaining of vaginal discharge and having to go to the doctor for that. Burning the family dinner accidentally was an idiom of distress. It was a way to communicate to your husband that you're pissed off. So, and the idea being that what makes it an idiom is the same way that you say something is a linguistic idiom.
Transcultural psychiatry takes cultural models of illness, cause, and treatment, as well as sociocultural expectations and stressors into effect when holistically considering what might be troubling a patient. The field also seeks to improve cross-cultural provision of treatment by understanding any cultural factors that might affect the therapeutic relationship. These cultural factors became key for American therapists and physicians working with recently arrived Cambodians in the early 1980s, not just with regards to idioms of distress, but also practices of health and healing.
The transition from the rice paddies of Southeast Asia to some of the most difficult urban environments in the West was staggering for even the most westernized Khmer.
I think one of the mistakes that we made in the very beginning was not to take into consideration those cultural differences, and I think we're still learning them a lot. I think that initially we would see children who came in who had been coined and had bruises on their chest walls and who had purple circles on their foreheads, and you're like, what is going on here, or you'd see children with scars on their abdomens, and when you work in New York City and you see that, and you think somebody's burning this kid with a cigarette.
Some doctors understand about our culture. They will not ask why you use coin rubber, because if you ask too many questions to the client, and he will get very upset. Why don't I use my belief?
I think there's no question that you have to respect these traditions. I mean, I think that many of these traditions are age-old and lifelong and part of what people bring with them to this country. I mean, I think that one basic reason to respect them is that it's important that people who come to this country not have all their cultural remnants be taken away from them. Clearly, some of the things that they've been doing for years and years are valuable.
Person-centered ethnography is more broadly interested in cultural influences on self and emotion across a wide spectrum of everyday and extraordinary life events. This methodology was developed by Robert Levy, who worked in Tahiti, and Douglas Holland, who worked with the Tarajan people in Sulawesi. In addition to participant observation, person-centered ethnography involves lengthy, semi-structured interviews which ask questions about a range of life experiences and psychological domains. Often focusing in-depth ethnographies on a handful of detailed and longitudinal case studies, person-centered ethnography can illustrate how private and public worlds interact, leading to commonalities and differences in individuals shaped by the same cultural environment and processes of socialization. These intersections and idiosyncrasies can help explain why some people end up having experiences that feel different, or why some people end up straying from, rejecting, or being rejected by the social norms others embrace or benefit from. Person-centered ethnography helped me understand the experience of Gusti Ayu, a young Balinese woman with Tourette syndrome.
Dijauhin ya? Karena sakit nih. Dikirain saya punya penyakit menular. Oh gitu. Jangan dekat-dekat sama itu. Oh itu sakit tuh. Oh kalau saya tidak biasa. Ya. Biasa. Karena saya ini perempuan muda mungkin itu. Dia takut kena. Dia takut kena, makanya dia menjauh. Tak usah dekat sama itu. Dia sakit. Cuma kan tanbani hijau. Sebenarnya kan tidak boleh begitu, Pak. Yeah. Ini kan penyakit tidak menular.
Iya, mungkin masih kalau tidak kerja.
Karena di sana desa mungkin ya terpencil, berbeda. Dikirain nanti penyakitnya itu menular. Tidak boleh rendah diri, walaupun bagaimana kita kan sakit. Tidak perlu menghiraukan orang.
Kasihan.
I've used person-centered ethnography for most of my research projects in Indonesia, including those on neurodiversity and mental health. The kind of information you can gather in person-centered ethnography interviews can help tell emotional and evocative stories on screen. I've used them as part of the visual psychological methodology I've been developing over the past 2 decades.
As developments in digital media have brought person-centered methods of psychological anthropology into the 21st century, advances in neuroscience have discovered the biological bases of human behavior, bringing new insights to the intersection of biology, individual, and culture. Neuroanthropology is a subfield first proposed by Greg Downey and Daniel Lende. This branch of anthropology studies how the brain mediates the relationship between individual and culture, particularly how culture might influence brain activity and therefore structure individual experience. Emotion, perception, cognition, skill acquisition, all these can be shaped by cultural learning.
The Wolfe hypothesis, as it's known, which is the idea that our language affects our thinking, has been debated for decades, even centuries.
There's a growing amount of experimental evidence that differences across languages have an influence on the way speakers of those languages conceive of the world. We can see that different languages structure the world in different ways. They carve up the various continua and different types of relations in the world.
The way that different languages chop up the world almost can vary, and that does actually influence how you see that world.
I think language changes everything about the way you think.
I go into a certain mindset. I sound deeper, I don't know why.
I perceive situations differently, I react differently.
I think I'm more grounded and more in touch with my emotions in German.
Yeah, it makes me feel more assertive when I'm speaking Dutch because you kind of just get straight to the point.
It's not just for talking. Language is for organizing an otherwise messy world into identifiable categories. It gives us ready labels.
It's like Lego. You add another word to the word and that makes it more precise.
Language in French is super gendered, so everything has a masculine or feminine, and it just makes everything feel a bit more one or the other.
If you have a word like bridge, if it's in a language where it is carrying a masculine gender, then bridges will be described by people slightly differently. So it might be its usefulness or its power might be more associated with the feminine gender, whereas its strength and its size might be more sort of associated with the masculine gender.
I think by virtue of being born into a particular culture and the language that goes with that culture, we're almost certainly given to think in a particular way.
The human brain doesn't work out of the box. You grow up and you're growing up learning languages in particular environments, so you've got, by the time you're dealing with an adult, you're dealing with a brain that has been trained up to be an expert along a number of quite specific dimensions.
Cultural differences in these neurological processes can be tracked by integrating lab techniques such as fMRI imaging with classic ethnographic methods such as participant observation and interviews. Whether we feel normal or deviant in some ways, and whether our communities accept or reject our differences, culture inescapably shapes our experiences and self-expression. Ultimately, anthropologists can use multiple methods to investigate the interactions of brain, self, and culture, illuminating both typical and atypical psychology and behavior in different societies.
Is there a personal, cultural, or subcultural way of being that differs from the mainstream that interests you? How do you think this difference relates to culturally expected norms, values, and behaviors? Which of the methods in this video might be the best fit for exploring this difference? Why?
Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to learn more, here are some useful resources in the description below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to get your regular dose of anthrodorphins.
If you want a historical perspective on the different styles of ethnographic film and how they developed, check out our History of Ethnographic Film video.